March 1945, Fort Sam Houston, Texas. The American medic stared at the girl's hands and whispered 4 words that would haunt him for decades. "How are you alive?" Her fingers were black, not bruised, black. Dead tissue that should have killed her weeks ago from blood poisoning. She'd crossed the Atlantic Ocean in a freezing cargo hold with 40 other women, and nobody had given her a single bandage. Now she sat in the enemy's hospital, 17 years old, waiting for the Americans to decide whether she deserved to keep her hands or her life. She'd been told Americans tortured prisoners. The propaganda had been clear: capture means death. But what happened in the next 40 minutes would shatter everything she believed about enemies, about mercy, about which side of the war had been telling the truth. This is the story of a German nurse whose hands were left to rot, and the small-town Oklahoma medic who had every reason to let her die, but didn't. What he did instead changed both their lives forever, and proved that even in history's darkest war, one choice could defeat an empire of hate. If you've never heard a World War II story like this, hit that subscribe button right now, because what you're about to witness will restore your faith in humanity. And make sure you watch until the very end, because the last words she whispered 64 years later will absolutely break your heart. Let's go back to that Texas morning when everything she knew about America was about to be proven wrong. The telegram arrived at Fort Sam Houston on a Tuesday morning when the sky hung low and grey over Texas. It said, "German prisoners arriving 800 hours, military auxiliaries, captured Belgium winter offensive, prepare standard detention protocols." Base Commander Colonel Warren Fisher read it twice, then handed it to his adjutant. "Get the men's barracks ready, notify the MPs, standard POW intake procedures." Nobody expected women. The trucks rolled through the gate at 8:15 hours, canvas covered, diesel engines coughing in the humid spring air. The guards at the checkpoint waved them through toward the detention compound, barbed wire fences and wooden barracks built for captured Luftwaffe crew or Wehrmacht infantry, the kind of prisoners America had been processing since 1943, when the tide turned and German soldiers started surrendering in North Africa by the thousands. But when the canvas flaps pulled back, what emerged were girls. 40 women in grey wool uniforms climbed down from the truck beds, moving slowly like people who'd forgotten how their legs worked. Some looked 16, some looked 25. All of them had the same expression, eyes fixed on the Texas ground, faces blank with exhaustion, bodies carrying something heavier than their small canvas bags. Sergeant Roy Kemp, clipboard in hand, stared at them for a full 10 seconds before remembering his job. He started calling names from a list typed by someone in Belgium who'd spelled everything phonetically. Hartmann Lisa, Voss Margaret, Dressler Ilse. Ilse Dressler stepped forward when she heard something close to her name. She was 17 years old, blonde hair chopped short like a boy's, and her hands were wrapped in gauze that had once been white, but now showed brown stains seeping through the fabric. She'd been wrapped like this for 3 weeks. The Atlantic crossing had been a nightmare told in darkness and ice, the cargo hold of a Liberty ship, designed to carry tanks and ammunition, not human beings. 40 women packed into a space 20 feet square, metal walls that sweated frozen condensation in February storms, temperatures that dropped so low their breath turned to frost on their lips. No blankets, no heat. The ship's captain had been told these were enemy prisoners, not priority passengers. Geneva Convention said they deserved basic treatment. Basic meant alive on arrival. They'd huddled together for warmth, pressing against each other in shifts. The women on the outside freezing while the ones in the center tried not to suffocate. Ilse had given up her center position on the second night to an older woman who was coughing blood. By the third night, Ilse couldn't feel her fingers anymore. By the 5th, they'd turned purple. By the 10th, she stopped looking at them. When the ship finally docked in Virginia, 14 days late because of storms, the Navy medic who opened the cargo hold had vomited over the side of the ship before calling for help. 2 women didn't walk off that ship. Their bodies were logged as transport casualties and buried in a military cemetery outside Norfolk with markers that said, "Unknown German National." Ilse walked off, barely. Now she stood in Texas sunlight so bright it felt like a physical weight, and waited to learn what came next. The The base hospital was a low white building with a red cross painted on the roof, protection against air raids that would never come here, thousands of miles from any front line. Inside, it smelled like disinfectant and floor wax and something clean that Ilse hadn't breathed in months. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, bright and steady, no flickering candles or dim basement bulbs. Everything gleamed. Captain Aldrich Pemberton ran the medical intake processing with tired efficiency. He was 53 years old, grey hair thinning at the temples, a Boston physician who'd volunteered in 1942, thinking he'd serve overseas and instead got assigned to POW administration in Texas. He'd examined hundreds of German prisoners, submarine crews pulled from the Atlantic, Afrika Korps soldiers captured in Tunisia, Luftwaffe pilots shot down over France. Most arrived healthy enough, thin maybe, exhausted certainly, but functional. These women were different. Malnutrition, he noted on his clipboard as the first girl stepped forward. Probable vitamin deficiency, send to kitchen for supplemental rations. Exposure injuries, he wrote for the next. Minor frostbite on extremities, standard treatment protocol. Then Ilse Dressler sat down in the examination chair. Pemberton gestured toward her hands. Let me see. She extended them slowly like someone presenting evidence at a trial. He began unwrapping the gauze. It stuck to the skin underneath. Ilse made a sound, not a cry, not a scream, just a small trapped noise like air escaping through a crack. The gauze came away in pieces. Pemberton stopped moving. For 3 full seconds he just stared at what was underneath. Then he turned toward the door and called, "Pruitt, I need you here, now." Emmett Pruitt had been restocking supply cabinets in the next room, counting sulfur powder packets and rolling fresh bandages into neat white cylinders. He was 22 years old, thin and tall, with dark hair that never stayed combed and hands that moved with careful precision. Oklahoma accent still thick despite 2 years in Texas. A medic who'd wanted to be a soldier but got reassigned because his left ear rang constantly from a childhood fever, damage that disqualified him from combat deployment. He'd spent 6 months feeling like a coward before the wounded started arriving from Europe. Then he stopped feeling anything except busy. He walked into the examination room and saw Ilse's hands. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. The frostbite had progressed to 3rd-degree damage on 3 fingers of her left hand. 2nd-degree burns, because that's what extreme cold did. It burned, covered both palms. The tissue was necrotic in places, dead flesh turning purple and grey and black where cells had frozen solid and never recovered. Infection had set in. Red lines radiated from the wounds up her wrists like poison rivers flowing toward her heart. She should have been screaming. Instead, Ilse Dressler sat perfectly still in the examination chair, eyes focused on a spot above Captain Pemberton's shoulder, breathing through her nose in short, controlled bursts. Pain so constant, it had become normal. Background noise she'd learned to live with the way soldiers learn to sleep through artillery fire. Emmett had treated combat injuries before. Soldiers shipped back from Europe with shrapnel wounds and bullet holes and burns from tank fires. But those men had received immediate medical care, field hospitals and morphine, and evacuation within hours. This girl had been left to rot for weeks, maybe months. The infection alone could kill her. Sepsis didn't care what uniform you wore. "How long has she been like this?" Emmett asked. Pemberton checked the transport manifest. Ship departed Belgium February 14th, arrived Virginia March 9th, sat in processing there for 6 days. That puts us at, he calculated, 5 weeks minimum since initial injury, possibly longer if it happened before embarkation. 5 weeks of dead tissue poisoning her bloodstream, 5 weeks of infection spreading, 5 weeks of pain that should have put her in shock. The paradox was obscene. America had spent billions of dollars developing medical technology to save its own soldiers. Sulfur drugs that fought infection, blood plasma that prevented shock, evacuation systems that moved wounded men from battlefield to surgery in under 12 hours. The U.S. Army Medical Corps had reduced the death rate from infected wounds to less than 4%, down from 30% in World War I. Penicillin was already being tested in military hospitals, showing results that seemed like miracles, and this girl had been left to die slowly in a ship's cargo hold because nobody considered her worth the cost of a blanket. "We need to debride immediately," Pemberton said. "Remove all necrotic tissue before the infection reaches bone." "If it's already in the bone," He didn't finish the sentence. They both knew. Amputation, possibly the whole hand, possibly her life if they were too late. Ilse watched them talk. She understood none of the English words, but she understood medical tone. She'd been a nursing student in Hamburg before the war, 2 years of training before the bombs started falling, and the university became a casualty clearing station. She knew what doctors sounded like. They discussed whether a patient could be saved. She'd expected this, not the discussion, the abandonment. In the Belgian holding facility, a guard had looked at her hands and laughed. Americans won't waste medicine on German dogs, he'd said in crude German. They'll let you rot. She'd believed him. Why wouldn't she? The propaganda had been clear. Americans were cruel. Profit-driven, obsessed with revenge. They executed prisoners. They tortured, captured soldiers. They had no honor, no mercy, no humanity. So when the ship locked her in darkness and cold for 3 weeks, it seemed like confirmation. When her fingers turned black and nobody came to help, it seemed like policy. When the pain became so intense she couldn't sleep, couldn't think, could only exist in a white-hot present tense of suffering, she'd accepted it as the price of being on the losing side. Now these American doctors were talking about saving her hand. It didn't make sense. Pemberton was already moving to the next patient. 40 women to process, limited time, military efficiency. Pruitt, this is your case. Clean it thoroughly. Debride all dead tissue, and I mean all of it. Don't leave anything that'll necrotize further. Sulfur powder, heavy application, fresh dressings changed twice daily. Keep her here for observation. Monitor for fever, increased swelling, red streaking past the wrist. Any signs of sepsis, you call me immediately. Understood? Yes, sir. She speak English? I don't think so, sir. Pemberton looked at Ilse for a moment. Her face was blank, distant, the expression of someone who'd stopped expecting the world to make sense. Well, do your best. She needs to understand we're trying to help her, not hurt her. Though I suppose the next hour is going to hurt like hell either way. He left. The room felt suddenly larger, quieter. Emmett gathered his supplies, surgical scissors, tweezers, antiseptic solution that would burn like fire on open wound, clean gauze rolls, sterile and white, sulfur powder in small paper packets, miracle drug developed in 1935, reduced infection mortality by 60%, the kind of medicine that could save lives if it wasn't too late. He approached Ilse slowly, the way you'd approach a frightened animal. She watched him with eyes that expected cruelty and had already decided not to resist, like she'd learned that fighting only made things worse, like she'd learned to endure. Emmett had seen that expression before on soldiers who'd been wounded too many times, who'd used up all their hope and had nothing left but stubborn survival. It made him angry, not at her, at whatever system had let a 17-year-old girl suffer like this for 5 weeks without help. He pulled up a stool and sat down so their eyes were level. "All right," he said quietly, knowing she didn't understand the words but hoping tone carried meaning. "This is going to hurt. I'm sorry for that. But we're going to fix this. You're going to keep these fingers. I promise you that." She stared at him, uncomprehending. He picked up the scissors and reached for her left hand. She flinched, a full-body tremor, but didn't pull away. That's when he understood. She thought this was the amputation. Emmett saw the fear flash across her face, the certainty that he was about to cut off her fingers right here, right now, without anesthesia or warning, just enemy disposal, efficient American cruelty. "No, no," he said quickly, holding up both hands, scissors pointing away. "Not cutting off, just cutting bandages, old bandages, see?" He mimed, unwrapping, his hands rotating around invisible gauze. Then he pointed to the roll of clean white bandages on the tray beside him. "Old off, new on, help, medicine, understand?" She didn't, but she stopped pulling away. He began cutting through the outer layers of stained gauze. The fabric had stiffened where blood and fluid had dried. Beneath it, the next layer was damp, stuck to skin with bodily seepage that smelled like infection, sweet and rotten at the same time. He'd smelled it before on soldiers who'd lain in muddy foxholes for days with untreated wounds. Gangrene had a specific odor. This wasn't quite that far gone, but it was close. He worked slowly, cutting away sections, peeling back layers that clung to dead tissue. Each piece that came free took bits of skin with it. Ilse's shoulders started shaking, fine tremors that ran down through her arms to her damaged hands. Not fear, pain. Pain so intense her body couldn't stay still. "Doing real good," Emmett said softly, keeping his voice steady and low. "You're braver than most soldiers I've treated. Just hang on a little longer." The words meant nothing to her, but the tone did. She focused on his voice like an anchor point, something to hold on to while her nervous system screamed. When the last bandage came free, he filled a steel basin with warm water, an antiseptic solution, iodine that turned the water amber-colored. He guided her hands into it gently. She gasped, a sharp intake of breath. The antiseptic hit, exposed nerve endings like liquid fire. Then the tears came, silent, steady, carving clean lines through the dust on her face. She cried without sobbing, without making noise, just water falling from eyes that had held it back for too long. Emmett let her hands soak for 3 minutes, giving the antiseptic time to work, killing bacteria on the surface. Then he began the debridement. This was the part that required precision. Dead tissue had to be removed completely, or it would continue to poison the living flesh around it. But you couldn't cut too deep, couldn't damage healthy tissue that was trying to regenerate. It was delicate work, more art than science, learned through practice on hundreds of wounds. He used tweezers to lift away necrotic skin, surgical scissors to trim the edges. The dead tissue was grey-black, firm, completely separated from living flesh underneath. On her left index finger, the damage went deep, through the outer dermis into the subcutaneous layer. On her palms, the skin had split in several places, frozen cracks that had never been cleaned properly, now filled with dried blood and infection. Ilse shook harder. Her breathing came in short bursts through clenched teeth. Tears fell steadily onto her lap, darkening the grey wool of her uniform. But she never pulled away. Emmett kept talking. "You're going to be okay. These will heal up fine if we keep them clean. You've got good tissue underneath all this damage. See?" He pointed to a spot on her palm where pink, healthy skin was visible beneath the grey. "That right there, that's healing already. Your body's doing the work. We're just helping it along." She couldn't understand his words, but she looked where he pointed. Saw the pink. Something flickered in her eyes, maybe hope, maybe just exhaustion-induced confusion. The process took 43 minutes total. By the time he finished debriding, the basin water had turned dark with blood and dead tissue. Her hands looked worse than when he'd started, raw, exposed, bleeding in places where he'd cut away the necrotic flesh. But they were clean, truly clean for the first time in 5 weeks. He dried them carefully with sterile gauze, patting gently around the wounds. Then he opened the sulfur powder packets, 6 of them, more than standard protocol recommended, but he wanted saturation coverage. The white powder fell like snow onto raw flesh, coating every exposed surface. Military medical studies had shown sulfur drugs reduced infection rates by 64% when applied within 72 hours of injury. Applied 5 weeks late, the effectiveness dropped to maybe 30%, but 30% was better than 0. 30% meant the difference between keeping fingers and losing them. He began wrapping fresh bandages, starting at the fingertips of her left hand, working down each digit individually, then across the palm, around the wrist, securing everything with careful tension, tight enough to protect, loose enough not to restrict blood flow. Then the right hand, less damaged but still serious, the same methodical process. When he finished, both her hands were wrapped in clean white gauze that seemed to glow under the fluorescent lights. He held them gently, checking his work, making sure the bandages would hold. "There," he said. "That's better, isn't it?" Ilse looked at her hands like she was seeing them for the first time, then at him, then back at her hands. Her lips moved, forming words in German he couldn't understand. Warum hilfst du mir? Why are you helping me?" The confusion in her voice was clear. The disbelief, the question that didn't make sense in the world she'd been taught to expect. Where enemies were enemies, where mercy was propaganda, where Americans were monsters who hurt German girls for sport. Emmett smiled. "You're gonna be okay." Something shifted in her expression. The glass wall cracked, just slightly, just enough to let a single, impossible thought enter. Maybe they lied to us about everything. Ilse returned to the medical ward every morning at 800 hours for the next 12 days. The routine became familiar, almost comforting in its predictability. An MP would escort her from the women's detention compound, barbed wire fences that seemed decorative compared to what she'd seen in Europe, guard towers where men read newspapers and drank coffee like this was just another boring assignment. She'd walk across the parade ground in early morning light, Texas sun already hot even in March, air tasting like dust, and something green, she'd later learn, was mesquite. Emmett would be waiting in the same examination room, supplies already laid out on the metal tray. Basin, antiseptic, fresh gauze, sulfur powder, surgical scissors that caught the light. She'd sit in the same chair by the window, hold out her hands without being asked. He'd unwrap the old bandages carefully, checking for signs that the infection was spreading or retreating, examining each finger for changes in color, temperature, swelling. The first 3 days were critical. That's when sepsis typically developed if it was going to. Blood poisoning that could kill within 72 hours once it reached the major organs. But by day 4, the angry red lines radiating up her wrists had faded. The swelling had decreased. The tissue underneath the damaged layers was pinking up, new skin cells dividing, regenerating, doing what healthy human bodies did when finally given the chance. Good, Emmett said on the 5th morning, genuine relief in his voice. Real good. Infection's clearing. You're healing ahead of schedule. Ilse watched his face while he worked. He was young, maybe 5 years older than her, though the war made everyone look older than they were. His hands moved with precise care, never rough, never hurried. He touched her damaged fingers like they mattered, like she mattered. It was disorienting. In Germany, she'd been told Americans were barbaric. Propaganda posters showed Uncle Sam with bloody hands, standing over piles of dead children. Radio broadcasts described torture camps where German POWs were starved and beaten. Her training instructor had said, if captured, expect no mercy. They hate us. They will make you suffer. But this man spent 30 minutes every morning cleaning her wounds with gentle precision, talking in a soft voice, even though she couldn't understand, smiling when the healing progressed. On the 7th day, she tried to communicate. She pointed to her hands, then to him, then pressed her palm to her chest. Danke, she said. Thank you. He understood that one. You're welcome. She frowned, frustrated by the language barrier. Then she tried in careful broken English that surprised them both. You, good, kind, I not understand. Why? Emmett blinked. You speak English? She held her thumb and forefinger close together. Little. School before war, not good, but some. Well, he grinned. Your English is better than my German, which is exactly 0 words. She almost smiled. The expression was tentative, fragile, like something she'd forgotten how to do properly. Then she said the thing that had been haunting her since that first treatment. In Germany, they tell us Americans are cruel, like animals. They say if captured, you will hurt us. Torture. Kill. Maybe worse. She paused, choosing words carefully from her limited vocabulary. I think when I come here, I think you will let my hands die. Punishment for being German. But you help. You use medicine. You are careful. I do not understand why. Emmett stopped wrapping her right hand. The question hung in the air between them, honest, direct, cutting through all the propaganda and political noise to something fundamental. He'd been asking himself similar questions. Late at night in the barracks, lying in his bunk, he'd wonder why he cared so much about one German girl's hands, when German soldiers had killed thousands of American boys, when German bombs had destroyed entire cities, when the full horror of the concentration camps was just starting to reach American newspapers, photographs of skeletal prisoners, mass graves, atrocities so enormous they defied comprehension. You couldn't just ignore that because one 17-year-old had frostbite, but you couldn't ignore the frostbite either because you needed help, he said. Fine. That's what medics do. We help people who need it. Doesn't matter what uniform they wore or which side they fought on. Pain is pain. Infection is infection. You treat the patient in front of you. Ilse was quiet for a long moment, processing. Then, I think this is good answer. I think maybe this is reason America will win. Not just because you have more gun, more planes, more everything, because you still see people as people. The paradox was sharp. 2 nations had spent years training their populations to hate each other, to dehumanize the enemy, to believe the other side was fundamentally evil. Millions of dollars poured into propaganda designed to make killing easier, surrender unthinkable, mercy impossible. And here in a Texas hospital ward, 40 minutes of careful medical treatment had shattered all of it. Emmett finished wrapping her hand and tied off the gauze. There. Good for another day. Keep them dry. Don't use your fingers for any heavy work yet. Healing tissue is fragile. She nodded. Then, in German-accented English that was getting clearer each day, tomorrow I come back. Same time? Same time, he confirmed. She stood to leave, then paused at the door. Emmett? He looked up. It was the first time she'd used his name. Thank you for seeing me. As person, not enemy. You were never an enemy to me, Ilse. Just a patient who needed help. After she left, Emmett sat alone in the examination room and thought about that word. Enemy. How easy it was to apply to millions of faceless people across an ocean. How impossible it became when you spent 12 mornings cleaning one person's wounds and watching their hands heal. The news came over the radio on May 8th, 1945, a Tuesday morning that felt like any other until it wasn't. Germany had surrendered. Unconditional. Total. The regime had collapsed. Hitler was dead. Berlin had fallen. The war in Europe was over. Ilse was working in the base laundry when the announcement crackled through the speakers mounted on the walls. She'd been assigned there after Captain Pemberton cleared her from daily medical treatment. Hands healed enough for light duty, scars still pink, but functional. The work was repetitive, washing, drying, folding endless mountains of sheets and towels and uniforms, hot steam rising from industrial machines, the sharp smell of soap and bleach. Her hands still ached by the end of each shift, tendons remembering damage, but they worked. All 10 fingers, full function. Emmett had kept his promise. The American women working in the laundry stopped immediately when the broadcast began. Someone turned up the volume. The announcer's voice filled the building, talking about victory, Allied triumph, the beginning of peace. Outside, the base erupted, servicemen shouting, trucks honking, someone firing shots into the air until an officer screamed at them to stop. Inside the laundry, the German women continued folding. Silence among them, heavy and complicated. Ilse stood at her table, hands moving automatically through motions her muscles knew by memory, and thought about Hamburg. Streets she'd walked as a child, now rubble, according to the reports that filtered through. Her mother and sister, whereabouts unknown. Communication with Germany had been impossible for months. They could be alive. They could be dead. She had no way to know. She thought about her father, killed in 1943 when a bomb hit his school during class hours. 23 students died with him. She'd been angry then, angry at the Allies for dropping the bomb, angry at the regime for starting a war that brought bombers to German cities, angry at the universe for being cruel and random and unforgivable. Now the regime had fallen. The leadership was dead or captured. The great ideological struggle that had consumed millions of lives had collapsed into ash, and mass graves and cities burned flat. And here she was, alive, in Texas, hands healed, folding American Army sheets. Consuelo Aguirre, the head laundress, found her during the lunch break. Consuelo was 56 years old, iron grey hair pulled back in a tight bun, hands roughened by decades of work. She'd lost a nephew at Normandy and a son-in-law in the Ardennes. She had every reason to hate the women in grey uniforms who worked under her supervision. Instead, she brought Ilse a cup of cold water. "You all right, mija?" Consuelo asked quietly. Ilse took the water. Her English had improved dramatically over 2 months of daily practice. "I do not know what I am. The war is finished. Germany is destroyed. I do not know if my family lives. I do not know what happens to us now. They'll send you home eventually. Repatriation, they call it. Process takes time, lots of paperwork. But you'll go back. Back to what?" Ilse's voice was flat. "There is nothing there. Cities are rubble. Economy is destroyed. Millions are dead. And we are the ones who lost. The ones who were wrong." Consuelo was quiet for a moment. Then, "War doesn't last forever. Nothing does. You're young. You'll rebuild. People always rebuild." That evening, Waltraud Goering organized a quiet gathering in the barracks common room. Waltraud was the oldest among them. 32, a communications officer captured in France, sharp-eyed and suspicious of everything. She'd spent 2 months warning the younger women not to trust American kindness, insisting it was propaganda designed to make them compliant. But even Waltraud's cynicism had limits. "We survived," she said. To the group of 37 women, 3 had been sent to other facilities for various administrative reasons. "After everything, we're still breathing. They'll decide what to do with us, send us home, hold us for questioning. Whatever the bureaucracy determines, But we're alive. Remember that. Ilse remembered something else too. Remembered Emmett spending 43 minutes cleaning her hand with painstaking care. Remembered Consuelo bringing her cold water on brutal summer days when the laundry temperature climbed past 100 degrees. Remembered the MP who'd escorted her to medical appointment and had learned to say Guten Morgen, even though he pronounced it terribly. Small kindnesses from people who'd been given permission by war to see her as less than human, who chose differently. Maybe that was how you rebuilt a destroyed world. One small choice at a time. One decision to see people as people instead of enemies. That night, she lay in her bunk and stared at her hands in the dim light. The scars were visible, pink lines across her palms, slightly darker patches on 3 fingers where the frostbite had gone deepest. They'd fade to white eventually, but they'd never disappear completely. Permanent marks, evidence of what she'd survived. Her hands had been sentenced to death in a frozen cargo hold. Now they were alive, functional, healing. Because one American medic had chosen to spend 43 minutes treating an enemy like a patient. The universe was brutal and random and often unforgivable. But sometimes, rarely, impossibly, it contained moments of grace that defied all logic. 2 weeks later, Emmett received reassignment orders. The war in the Pacific was still raging. Japan fought on despite Germany's collapse. Personnel were being redistributed, medics sent to prepare for the anticipated invasion of the Japanese homeland. He was heading to California, to a staging hospital in San Diego, where they were training staff for the massive casualties everyone expected. He saw Ilse one last time by chance, near the base commissary. She was carrying a box of supplies, hands bare now, no bandages, just scars. She set down the box when she saw him. "You are leaving." Not a question. Somehow she knew. Yeah, new orders, California. They need medics for whatever comes next in the Pacific. She extended her right hand, the one that had been damaged worst, the one he'd thought might require amputation. "Thank you, Emmett, for my hands, for showing me that not all Americans are what they told us." He shook her hand carefully, conscious of the healed tissue, the scars rough under his palm. Her grip was strong. "Good luck, Ilse. I hope you get home safe. I hope you find your family. Good luck to you. I hope you help many more people." They stood there for a moment, 2 people whose lives had intersected briefly in the chaos of war, who'd taught each other something about humanity that no propaganda could erase. Then he left. She picked up her box and continued working. The Texas sun blazed overhead, indifferent and eternal. Ilse Dressler was repatriated to Germany in November 1945. The process took 6 months, paperwork processed through military bureaucracy, security clearances, interviews with intelligence officers who asked careful questions about what she'd seen, what she'd known, what role she'd played. She was 17 years old, clearly not a war criminal, guilty of nothing more than being a nurse in the wrong uniform at the wrong time. They cleared her without incident. The transport ship that carried her back across the Atlantic had heat, blankets, hot food served twice daily, proper medical staff who checked on passengers. The crossing took 11 days and nobody's hands turned black from cold. The ship docked in Hamburg on a grey morning in late November. Ilse walked down the gangplank into a city she didn't recognize. The destruction was total. Entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble, not damaged, destroyed, gone. Streets she'd walked as a child now just cleared paths through debris. Buildings that had stood for 200 years now existed only in memory. People lived in basements and cellars, scavenging for food, burning furniture for warmth. British occupation forces maintained order. He arrived in California, atomic bombs ending the war before the anticipated invasion. Instead, he treated thousands of patients returning from both theaters, soldiers shattered by combat, minds and bodies broken by things they'd seen and done. He saved some, lost others, did his best with all of them. He married a nurse named Dorothy Chen in 1947, daughter of Chinese immigrants, working at the San Diego Naval Hospital. They had 2 sons who both became doctors, carrying forward the family tradition of healing. The ringing in his left ear never stopped. That permanent reminder of the childhood fever that had kept him from combat became something like a friend. Background noise he learned to live with. He thought about Ilse sometimes over the years, wondered if she'd made it home, hoped she had, hoped her hands had healed completely. hoped she'd found whatever passed for peace in a ruined continent, trying to rebuild. He tried once to find her in 1978 when he was thinking about retirement, wrote to the Red Cross, contacted military archives, searched through repatriation records. But the trail was cold. Too much time had passed, too many records lost or destroyed, the bureaucracy of two countries, decades of separation, the simple vastness of the world. He never knew for certain what happened to her. But sometimes he'd treat a patient with terrible injuries, burns, frostbite, wounds that should have been fatal but somehow weren't. And he'd work with the same deliberate care he'd learned in Texas. And he'd think about her, about that moment when she'd extended her healed hand to shake his, when she'd thanked him in careful English, when two people from opposite sides of history's worst war had found a moment of shared humanity. He died in 1996 at 73 years old, heart attack in his garden on a Sunday morning, quick and relatively painless. He never knew that the girl whose hands he'd saved had lived a full life, raised 3 children, worked as a nurse for 4 decades, and whispered his name with her final breath. The historians note it in footnotes now. Over 400,000 German POWs passed through American custody during World War II. The vast majority were treated according to Geneva Convention standards, adequately fed, housed, given medical care that met minimum requirements. Some, like Ilse Dressler, were treated with something closer to compassion. These weren't the stories that won medals or made headlines. They were small moments that happened too quietly to change the war's grand outcome, but they changed individual lives completely. They rebuilt trust slowly, person by person, across decades of reconciliation. They were the stories that mattered most in the end. March 1945, Texas, a girl's hands wrapped in gauze so white it hurt to look at. Underneath, skin was healing, cells dividing, tissue regenerating, life persisting. A morning in late November, Ilse walked down the gangplank into a city she didn't recognize. The destruction was total. Entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble, not damaged, destroyed, gone. Streets she'd walked as a child now just cleared paths through debris. Buildings that had stood for 200 years now existed only in memory. People lived in basements and cellars, scavenging for food, burning furniture for warmth. British occupation forces maintained order with military efficiency, but the population was shell-shocked, traumatized, struggling to process what had happened. Ilse found her mother alive in a village 30 kilometers outside the city. The reunion happened in a small room with cracked windows and a wood stove that barely heated the space. Her mother had aged 20 years in 3, but she was breathing, surviving. Lotta is in England, her mother said. She married a British soldier, living in Manchester now, pregnant with her first child. The news felt surreal. Her younger sister, who'd been 15 when Ilse last saw her, married to a former enemy, carrying a half-British child, living in the country that had bombed their city to ruins. The world had turned upside down and kept spinning. Ilse returned to nursing school in 1946. It took 3 years to complete her degree in the chaos of post-war Germany, studying in makeshift classrooms with used textbooks, limited supplies, constant shortages. But she finished. Spent the next 42 years working in hospitals across Germany. Hamburg first, then Munich, then Berlin after reunification, treating patients with the same careful attention Emmett Pruitt had shown her. She married a teacher named Friedrich Weber in 1952. They had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son, raised them to believe in peace, understanding, the importance of seeing past labels to the humans underneath. She told them the story of the American medic who'd saved her hands when he had every reason not to, who'd chosen kindness when propaganda demanded cruelty. She lived to see Germany reunified, watched the Berlin Wall come down in 1989, tears streaming down her face as people danced in streets that had been divided for decades, saw her grandchildren grow up in a peaceful Europe that seemed impossible during those dark years when everything burned. She lived a good life, a full life, a lucky life considering. And sometimes on summer days, when heat shimmered just right and the sky stretched wide and endless, she'd look at her hands, old now, spotted with age, marked by faint scars across the palms that never quite disappeared, and she'd remember Texas, the dust against damage, and odds, and every reason to give up. A medic worked carefully, gently, treating an enemy like a patient. A girl accepted help from someone she'd been taught to fear and learned that propaganda lied. Somewhere in that exchange, one human being caring for another across the vast divide of war, something shifted. Wounds could heal, scars would remain. But kindness was always possible. Even in the darkest moments of human history, individual human beings could choose to be better than their circumstances demanded. The choice echoed across decades, across lives, across an ocean and a war, and all the hatred that should have made mercy impossible. Two people who never saw each other again carried that truth forward into a world that desperately needed to remember it.